Okay, here's your first online lecture in argumentation, and I'm Dr. Stephen Weiss. I uploaded another short video about the course, and it was very staticky, so I'm doing this one and I'm hoping I don't encounter the static. When I record it, it sounds fine, but after I upload it, I'm getting a lot of static, so I don't know if that's the encoding to send it up to YouTube, but I'm sure I will work that out. Anyway, Argumentation Chapter 1. Hope you had a chance to read the preface and Chapter 1, and even if not, my comments will be pretty meaningful, very straightforward. So in Chapter 1, we explore what are the principles of argumentation, and I'm going to jump right into principle number 1, which is that argumentation is primarily a rational activity. So what do I mean by that? Well, in order to understand that principle, you have to understand what we're talking about when we say that something is rational or that people are rational. We obviously know that many of us do irrational things, and we don't always think rationally. After all, we're not Mr. Spock. We behave illogically. We do things that aren't good for our health. We make poor decisions. We make bad decisions. Sometimes we look at evidence, and even though it's pointing toward a particular conclusion, we deny that conclusion. But those are more psychological aspects of what it is to be human, rather than they are aspects of rationality. Rationality is that capacity or ability that humans have to be able to make inferences, to be logical, to reason. If you think about in your life, for example, how you learned language, that was a very rational sort of thing to begin to put together all the elements of the vocabulary, the grammar, the syntax, the rules, and the social constructions necessary to communicate with other people and to speak in a language. And every human being seems to be hardwired to do that, because all over the world, no matter what the language, people seem to acquire language pretty much roughly the same way. You could say the same things about skills like mathematical inference. Again, everyone can be taught those things, and it might even be suggested that those abilities are already there, built into your brain or your mind, and you just bring them out through a process of education or teaching or some kind of prompting. But we're rational. So when we say that argument is rational, it means that it taps into that part of our brain, the part that can make inferences, avoid contradictions, see things for what they are, be logical, reason, be reasonable, and also exclude things which are irrational. So what's an example of something that's irrational? Well, let's say I was accused of a crime, and my defense was that some sort of a demon told me to commit the crime. Now, it may very well be that a demon did tell me to commit the crime, but the point is, how would we rationally assess that claim? For example, if the prosecutor said to me, "Steve, how do you know that there was a demon?" And I said something like, "Well, he's invisible, but I know he's real." And the prosecutor said, "Well, how would we have access to him?" He said, "Well, you don't see him, do you? I told you he's invisible." That would be irrational, because nobody else would be able to ascertain the basis of that claim. So basically, when we say argument is a rational activity, we're saying it relies on human reason, and all of its claims are open to the same sort of investigation and scrutiny that anybody else on earth could claim. You could never say, for example, that I experienced something or I know something and I'm the only one that knows it and nobody else has access to or is privileged enough to understand this. So that's what we mean by argument being rational or rational activity. Principle number 2 is that arguing is not just expressing opinions. So you've often heard people say, I've heard my students say this, for example, when I assign papers, do you just want our opinions or is this a research paper? Well, in argumentation, we don't make that distinction. We talk about making an argument and we talk about backing it up. That's all part of the same thing. How do you back up a research paper? Well, you provide evidence, data, studies, things that you've looked up and researched. If you make an argument and you don't back it up, it's not really an argument. It's just the initial expression of the claim that you're trying to prove. But what supports the claim is just as much a part of the argument as the claim itself. So for example, if I said something like, students should never have to pay tuition, I haven't really made an argument. I've made a claim, which if I'm going to turn it into an argument, I'm going to have to support by providing evidence, data, statistics, study. I'm going to have to be able to prove things like, is that affordable or feasible or even possible or realistic? So arguing isn't just expressing opinions. So get over the idea that when we're arguing, we're just giving our opinions. We're giving our opinions first and then backing them up and supporting them with good reasons. Principle number 3 is that argument is always grounded, and that is that the words we use, the numbers that we bring forward as evidence, the concepts that we offer, the ideas that we present always have a grounding, meaning that they always exist in a context and situation. They are never outside space or time and don't lack some sort of reality or connection to our real lives. A good example of this, by the way, was, I don't know how many of you saw the State of the Union address that Obama delivered, but in the State of the Union, he was talking about how we have to spend a lot more money on medical research. After the speech was over, some of the people who were discussing it were saying, gee, he didn't talk much about how to combat terrorism. And one of the critics pointed out, well, that if we spent $1 trillion combating terrorism at the current rate, we would probably save 15 or 20 lives a year, because that's the average of the amount of people over the past 10 years who have been killed by terrorists. If you spend $1 trillion fighting cancer, you could save millions and millions of people. So the argument was made that the idea that we have to do everything possible and spend everything possible to fight terrorism isn't a grounded argument. It's compared to what? It's kind of like that movie The Martian, if you saw it, where they spent obviously billions of dollars to go back to Mars to rescue one guy. Nobody ever really asked the question, well, is it really worth going that far and spending that much money to rescue one guy? There was no cost-benefit analysis, so to speak. So argument always has a context in which it becomes realistic. You never are dealing with a pure essential form of an argument. There's always conditions or circumstances around it. Principle number 4, argument not only involves making claims, but also supporting and defending them. So this goes back to the idea that argument isn't just opinion making, but it goes further than that. Not only do you support them, you defend your claims, because in argumentation you have an opponent, or at least there's another side to the position that you're arguing. After all, you don't have to make an argument if it's not controversial. I always tell my public speaking students that you don't need to try to persuade people to exercise, because exercise is good for them. Who's going to take up the other side of the argument and say, don't exercise because you don't want to be healthy? So real arguments are conflicts or controversies over claims that are themselves actually controversial and open to dispute. So if you don't dispute them, you don't really have an argument going on. And so when you support your arguments, again, with evidence, reasoning, being rational, as I talked about before, you're also inviting criticism and response, and so you also have to know how to defend your arguments and buttress them against an opponent's attack. And that's called rebuttal, in case you haven't heard that term before. That's a term we use in argument and debate a lot. Principle number 5, argument is prepared and presented in anticipation of judgment. So there are several different ways that you can study argument. One, you can study argument in a very formal way, like they do in logic and philosophy classes, where you look at arguments. Sometimes you turn them into a formal version of themselves, like almost like a mathematical version, and then you test them for validity or soundness, or whether or not the conclusions follow from the premises. And then sometimes argument is presented or is studied just as presentation, how effective you are in delivering your speech or your ideas. But important dimension that's often left out in discussing arguments, in which the focus is on the argument itself or how it's presented or delivered, is the person who's judging or evaluating the argument. And that's an essential thing. When you make an argument, not only do you make a claim and support it and defend it against attack, but you also imagine that somebody is going to render a judgment or a decision of whether or not the argument was effective or successful. Think about it. If you are applying to graduate school, for example, and you have to write an essay, and you submit the essay, you would never imagine that somebody was not going to read the essay. And if somebody's going to read the essay, that means somebody's going to judge whether or not the writing that you've done, the arguments you've made, the claims you've made are good and well supported. So that's what I'm saying. We always argue with the judge in mind, and any treatment of argumentation that leaves out the judge is missing one of the most important regulative aspects of argument. Argument is designed to have somebody say, I agree with it or I don't agree with it, or this side prevails or that side. Think of a court trial and how that's set up, where one side will win because a judgment is rendered. Principle number 6, argument differs from persuasion. So this is actually a very big concept, and I have a whole separate lecture about this, which I'll give you later on in the semester. But just to cover this in a nutshell, persuasion, the art of getting what you want, can happen whether or not you make an argument. Let's say you wanted to get a grade changed on a paper you'd written, and you go to the professor, and before you even say anything or make an argument or ask or give the reasons why you think your grade should be changed, the professor says, oh, I'm in a good mood today, I'll change your grade. You achieved exactly what you were trying to achieve by going to the professor and asking to get your grade changed. No argument, persuasion took place. But there's also situations where argument takes place and persuasion does or does not take place. So for example, let's say you went into court and you made a perfect argument why a ticket that you got should be revoked, that you shouldn't have to pay it. And the judge says something to you like the following, and judges can really say things like this. Well, that's a very good argument, but I'm still going to invoke the penalty and you're still going to have to pay the ticket. So he's basically saying you made a good argument, but I'm not going to count it as persuading me. There's no necessary connection between those two things. And again, I'll explore that later on. It's an interesting problem in argument and debate. Principle number 7. The conditions under which one argues are at least as important as the arguments one makes. Okay, so think about this. You're growing up in your house, right? And you ask your parents, maybe when you're in high school, if you can do something you've never done before. Like, for example, you're going to borrow the car, you're going to go with a friend, and you're going to stay out all night, like stay at his house or something like that. It's the first time you've ever done that in your life. And you make very good reasons, and you lay out the fact that you're very responsible and that you've never been in trouble, and you'll check in. You have all your argumentative ducks in a row, okay? And it's all over. You've laid out your case, and your dad says, well, that's all well and good, but I make the rules in this house, and you can't do that. In other words, your dad is telling you that the social rules of argument in his house is no matter what you ask for, no matter what you claim, he still has the power, he's the dad, he owns the car, he makes the decision, and the conditions under which you're arguing, which are no-win conditions, are just as important as the argument itself. And I'm sure you've been in that situation many, many times in your life where somebody will say something like, well, I understand what you're saying and I certainly sympathize with you and I think you're correct, but there's nothing I can do about it because of this, because there are rules that govern how you can argue. This happens in courts all the time because people make motions that make things out of order in the court, and therefore they can't be argued. So the rules of argument can govern just what success you have in argument just as much as the argument itself. And finally, we are arguing all the time. Think about it. You argue with yourself. You convince yourself or talk yourself into things. You rationalize. You made a bad decision, and yet you try to convince yourself it wasn't a bad decision. And this is something in the nature of our psychology. I'll talk a lot more about this later in a subsequent lecture as well. But this is kind of an overview, so I just thought I'd cover the first 8 principles all at once.